The Duke gave every lady control of his fields. The rejected woman brought them back to life. The kingdom's richest estate is on the brink of disaster. After years of drought, disease, and poor management, the Duke's once famous fields have become barren. Determined to find a wife with intelligence rather than beauty alone, the Duke announces an unusual challenge. Every noble lady seeking his hand will be given control of a section of his land for 1 month. Whoever restores it best will become the future Duchess. Elegant noblewomen arrive with expensive tools, lavish workers, and endless confidence. They throw grand banquets instead of inspecting the soil, blame servants for every failure, and waste the estate's fortune chasing quick results. One by one, their fields wither. Among the applicants is Elena, the daughter of a ruined farming family. Mocked for her plain clothes and dismissed as unfit for a duke, she is rejected before the contest even begins. Refusing to leave in shame, she secretly helps exhausted laborers at night, studies the damaged land, and discovers that the soil isn't cursed, it has been poisoned by years of greed and neglect. Working with loyal farmers, Elena revives forgotten irrigation systems, rotates crops, enriches the soil naturally, and earns the trust of the villagers. Within weeks, her neglected plot transforms into the only thriving field on the estate, bursting with golden wheat while every other section lies in ruin. As harvest season arrives, the kingdom is stunned. Elena's fields produce enough grain to feed thousands and save nearby villages from famine. But just as the Duke prepares to honor her, evidence surfaces that one jealous noblewoman deliberately sabotaged the other competitors' fields and framed Elena to steal her success. Refusing to let an innocent woman be disgraced, the Duke launches an investigation that exposes a web of corruption reaching deep into the royal court. The conspirators are stripped of their titles, while Elena's honesty and wisdom inspire the entire kingdom. In front of the gathered nobles, the Duke admits his greatest mistake wasn't rejecting Elena, it was judging her by her appearance instead of her character. Instead of accepting his proposal immediately, Elena makes one condition: the estate's farmers must receive fair wages, land rights, and respect before she will become Duchess. The Duke agrees without hesitation. Together, they transform the neglected estate into the most prosperous land in the kingdom, proving that true nobility is measured not by birth or beauty, but by courage, compassion, and the ability to help others flourish. The dust never really left Bianca Morti's hands. She could scrub them 10 times in the tin basin behind her father's old house, and some of the grit always found its way back under her nails, like the earth wanted to remind her where she came from. She was 23 years old, and she had buried both her parents in the dry ground behind that same small house. Her mother 3 winters back, her father just this past spring. Both times she stood there in the same black dress, the one that used to be blue before all the washing wore the color out of it, and both times she remembered the thing he used to tell her when the crops failed and the coin purse went light. The land doesn't lie, Bianca, people lie. The land just tells you the truth whether you want to hear it or not. She thought about those words the whole 3 miles into town, the morning the entire province gathered outside the iron gates of Villa Visconti. By the time she got there, her shoes were coated white with road dust, and her hair had come loose from its pins. She stood at the very back of the crowd, behind carriages polished so bright she could see her own tired face in them, and watched noble families spill out in silk, the color of sunrise, of wine, of things Bianca had only ever seen in her mother's old fabric scraps. Up on the stone steps of the villa stood Duke Matteo Visconti. Bianca had heard about him her whole life the way you hear about weather in a place you've never been. Young, serious, not yet married, though he was well past the age most dukes took a wife. People said his father had left him land that was dying by the acre, and a title that meant less each season the harvests kept failing. He didn't look like a man who smiled much. He stood very straight, hands clasped behind his back, and when he spoke, his voice carried clean across the whole courtyard without him needing to shout. "My family's land is dying," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise, not to you and not to myself. The eastern fields have gone 3 years without a real harvest, the wells run low, the soil cracks under the sun like old leather." A murmur moved through the crowd. Bianca felt her chest tighten. She knew those fields. She had walked past them 100 times, and every time something in her had ached at the sight of good earth left to die. "So I am done with courtship as my father knew it," the Duke went on. "I will not choose a wife based on how she dances or how she speaks at a dinner table. I need a wife who can save what is left of this land, because if she cannot, there will be nothing left to inherit at all. He explained the trial then. 12 noble ladies, 12 plots of the dying eastern acreage, 1 month each to work the soil however they saw fit with the help they could gather. At the end, the woman whose land showed the most life, the most hope of a real harvest, would become his wife, and duchess of whatever future the estate still had. Bianca watched 12 names get called from a long parchment, beautiful names from beautiful families. Lady Vittoria Contarini stepped forward first, chin high, already looking like she'd won something. One by one the others followed, silk skirts sweeping the dusty ground like it owed them an apology for touching their hems. Bianca stood there a long moment after the last name was called, her heart pounding harder than it had any right to. Then she did something she'd been telling herself the whole walk here that she wouldn't do. She stepped forward. "Your Grace," her voice came out steadier than she felt, "I would like to be considered as well." The crowd's laughter came before the Duke even had the chance to answer. It rippled out from the nobles closest to her, spread back through the courtyard like a stone thrown in still water. Someone said, loud enough for her to hear, that the girl smelled like a barn. Someone else asked if she'd wandered in from delivering the milk. Bianca kept her spine straight. She'd learned a long time ago that the moment you let your shoulders drop in front of people like this, you gave them exactly what they wanted. The Duke looked at her, really looked for just a second, and something in his face almost softened. Then one of his men leaned in and murmured something in his ear. And whatever had been there in his eyes closed back over like a door. "This trial is for the noble houses," the Duke said, "not cruel exactly, just final. I'm sorry." "I understand soil," Bianca said, and she hated that her voice cracked on the last word. "My father was an agronomist. He taught me everything he knew before he died. I could show you if you'd only let me." "The decision stands." He had already turned half away from her. "Clear the courtyard. The ladies will be shown to their plots by evening." And that was that. Bianca walked home the 3 miles with her jaw clenched so tight it ached, past the very fields she'd just been turned away from. The eastern acreage stretched out on both sides of the road, cracked and grey-brown, weeds growing in patches that looked more like scars than plants. She stopped at the low stone wall that marked the edge of the property and looked out over land that everyone else saw as worthless. She saw something else, she always had. Her father used to say some people looked at dying land and saw only the ending. He taught her to look and see the middle of a story instead. Something had happened to that soil. Something had gone wrong in a way that drought alone didn't explain, and dead people don't get to finish their sentences, but Bianca remembered enough of what he'd started teaching her to want to find out. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay on her narrow bed listening to the house settle around her, empty now in a way it never used to be, and she thought about her father's old canvas satchel still hanging by the door. His tools, his notebooks, water-stained and dog-eared, full of handwriting she knew better than her own. Around midnight she got up. She dressed in her work clothes, the plain brown ones nobody laughed at because nobody who mattered ever saw them, and she took the lantern down from its hook. Her hands shook a little as she filled it with oil. Not from fear exactly, from something closer to hope, and hope had always scared her more than fear did, because hope was the thing that could actually be taken from you. She walked back to the eastern fields under sky so full of stars it looked unreal, and she let herself in through a gap in the old stone wall where nobody would think to look, on a strip of land past the 12 marked plots, land so far gone that not even the trial had bothered to claim it. She knelt in the dirt. She dug her bare fingers into the ground the way her father taught her, feeling for moisture, for texture, for the small signs that told a story if you knew how to read them. The soil felt wrong under her hands, not just dry, wrong. She pulled a small glass vial from the satchel, one of her father's old testing kits, and she took a sample by lantern light, her breath fogging faintly in the cool night air. She mixed it the way he'd shown her 100 times, watched the colour bloom slow and strange in the little glass tube, and her stomach dropped straight through the ground beneath her knees. This wasn't drought. Drought didn't turn soil this colour. Drought didn't leave a chemical bite in the air that clung to the back of her throat like something bitter left too long on the tongue. Someone had put something into this earth, something that killed slow and quiet, the kind of poison that let everyone blame the sky instead of asking who really stood to gain from land nobody wanted anymore. Bianca sat back on her heels in the dark, lantern light flickering across her face. and for the first time since her father died, she felt something other than grief crack open in her chest. She thought of the Duke's voice from that afternoon. There will be nothing left to inherit at all. He had no idea how right he was, or how wrong about the reason. Bianca looked out over the ruined fields stretching silent under the stars, land that everyone else had already buried in their minds the way she'd buried her own parents. Rejected before the trial even began, she should have gone home. She should have let this be someone else's problem, someone with a title and silk skirts and a proper invitation. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves, picked up her father's old trowel and got to work. Nobody had given her permission to save this land. She decided, kneeling there in the cold dirt with dirt under her nails and her father's voice still ringing in her ears, that she didn't need it. The weeks that followed blurred together into dirt under her nails, and aching shoulders and stars. She knew better than her own reflection. Bianca worked the outer fields every night after the sun went down, when the 12 noble ladies and their hired hands had long since packed up their fine tools and gone back to soft beds in the villa. She worked alone at first, just her, the lantern, and her father's old satchel, mixing lime into the poisoned soil the way his notebooks taught her, flushing the worst patches with water carried bucket by bucket from the creek a half-mile off. Her back screamed at her by the second week. Her hands split and bled in the creases of her palms, and she wrapped them in strips of old cloth and kept going, because stopping meant thinking about her father, and thinking about her father still hurt too much to sit still with. She wasn't alone for long, though. The first to come was old Enzo, who used to work these same fields before the Visconti family let half the tenant farmers go the year the harvests started failing. He found her on her knees in the dark one night, testing soil by lantern light, and instead of asking what she was doing out there like a madwoman, he just knelt down beside her and asked what she needed. Lime, she told him, her voice rough with exhaustion, and hands, and people who won't ask the Duke's permission before they decide to help me. Enzo brought his 2 grown sons the next night. Word passed quiet after that, the way it does among people who have all lost something to the same hard years. A widow named Costanza came with her own worn shovel. A boy no older than 14 showed up with nothing but willing hands and a hunger in his eyes that told Bianca he understood exactly what it meant to watch land die around you and feel helpless to stop it. By the 3rd week, there were 9 of them working that strip of forgotten earth by starlight, saying almost nothing, because the work said everything that needed saying. And the land began to answer. Bianca still remembered the morning. She saw the first green shoot push up through soil that had been grey and cracked a month before. She dropped to her knees right there in the dirt and pressed her palm flat against the ground, like she could feel the plant breathing. And she'd cried for the first time since her father's funeral, quiet tears that she wiped away fast before anyone could see. Word of the 12 noble ladies' plots was a different story entirely. Bianca heard the talk in town, the way everyone heard everything eventually. Lady Vittoria Contarini's plot, the grandest of all 12, showing the least life of any of them. She'd brought in expensive fertilizer shipped from the coast, hired the finest gardeners money could buy, and none of it mattered, because none of them understood what her father always said. The land doesn't care how much coin you throw at it. It only answers people willing to listen. Bianca understood the poison now too, or at least understood it better. It wasn't just old drought settled deep into tired ground. Someone had dumped something into that soil on purpose, something that seeped and spread and killed slow, and the 12 official plots sat right in the worst of it. No wonder nothing the noble ladies tried was working. They were fighting the wrong enemy with the wrong weapons, and they didn't even know it. Bianca's strip of land, the forgotten sliver past the official boundary, had somehow escaped the worst of the poison. That, or her father's methods, simply ran deeper than anyone else's. Either way, by the start of the 4th week, her field wasn't just alive, it was gold. Wheat, tall and full and swaying gentle in the evening wind, stretching further than Bianca had ever let herself hope for. She stood at the edge of it one dusk with Enzo beside her, both of them just looking, neither one saying a word, because some things are too big for words and you'd only cheapen them by trying. "Your father would be proud," Enzo finally said. Bianca's throat tightened so hard she couldn't answer him. She just nodded and kept looking at the gold. She should have known better than to think something that beautiful could stay hidden. It was Lady Vittoria who found it first, though Bianca never learned exactly how. Maybe a servant's loose tongue, maybe simple bad luck, a wrong turn on a ride out past the official boundary. However it happened, word came back to Bianca 3 days later through Costanza's daughter, who worked in the villa kitchens and heard things she wasn't meant to hear. Lady Vittoria had seen the wheat, and Lady Vittoria was afraid. Her own plot, once the pride of the whole trial, had turned brittle and brown despite every coin she'd poured into it. Rumour in the villa said the Duke had already started asking her uncomfortable questions about her progress, the kind of questions that ended engagements before they ever began. A woman that desperate, Bianca would come to understand, does desperate things. Bianca found out just how desperate 3 nights later. She arrived at her field before dawn, same as always, lanterns swinging at her side, and stopped so hard at the edge of the wheat that Enzo nearly walked straight into her back. Half the field lay trampled, not from wind, not from animals. Boot prints, dozens of them, crushed clean rows straight through her golden wheat like something out of a nightmare. And worse than the trampled stalks, worse than the ruined weeks of work, someone had left something behind in the wreckage. A torn scrap of cloth from Vittoria's own official plot, dropped and half buried in the dirt like it had fallen during a struggle. And beside it, driven into the ground like a flag planted on stolen land, a small vial of the same chemical Bianca had found poisoning the soil that very first night, the one from her father's testing kit. Except it wasn't her father's vial, it was a copy, a cheap, careless copy, but close enough to damn her if the right person found it and didn't look too closely. Someone wants it to look like you poisoned your own field, Enzo said quietly, kneeling to study the wreckage, and sabotaged the official plots to hide it. Bianca's hands shook as she picked up the vial, turning it over in the grey dawn light. She thought of her father's voice again, the one that never left her no matter how many years passed. The land doesn't lie, people lie. Someone had lied here and lied well, and now that lie had her name written all over it. She didn't get the chance to decide what to do about it. 2 of the Duke's guards found her still kneeling there an hour later, vial in her bruised hand, trampled wheat all around her, and Bianca Morti, the woman turned away at the gates a month before for the crime of being too poor to matter, was marched back to the very villa that had once refused to hear her name. She stood in the same courtyard where she'd first been laughed at, except this time the silence that fell over the gathered crowd felt sharper, colder, like a held breath waiting to see who would break first. Lady Vittoria stood near the front of the crowd, her face arranged into something that almost passed for shock, almost passed for sympathy, if you didn't know to look for the small satisfied tightness at the corner of her mouth. Duke Matteo Visconti stepped forward, and for one brief moment, Bianca thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or memory of a woman who had once stood in this same spot and told him plainly that she understood soil better than anyone he'd invited through his gates. Then his jaw set hard, the way it had that very first day, and he spoke the words that Bianca would carry in her chest like a stone for a long time after. Bianca Morti, you stand accused of sabotage against this trial and against the very land you claim to love. What do you have to say for yourself? Bianca lifted her chin, even though her whole body shook with exhaustion and fear and something close to fury. I have the truth, she said, her voice cracking but not breaking, whether anyone here is willing to hear it or not. The courtyard held its breath, waiting on her next words, and Bianca Morti gave them the only thing she had left to give, the truth. She reached into her father's satchel with hands that would not stop shaking and pulled out his real testing kit, the worn leather case with his initials burned into the corner, the one he'd carried for 30 years before he handed it down to her. She held it up next to the cheap vial the guards had found planted in her field. Look at them, she said, loud enough to carry across the stone courtyard. Really look, mine is scratched from years of use, that one is new. Whoever left it in my field never thought anybody would compare the 2 side by side. A murmur moved through the crowd, but Bianca wasn't finished. I found poison in this soil the very first night I came out here, weeks before the trial ever began. Not just in my strip of land, in all of it. Every plot every one of these ladies has been working herself sick over. That's why nothing they tried has worked. You can't outgarden a poison you don't know is there. She looked straight at Lady Vittoria then, and something in Vittoria's face flickered just for a second before the mask slid back into place. Someone poisoned this land on purpose, Bianca said. And someone is desperate enough to frame an innocent woman rather than let that truth come out. The Duke's senior bailiff, a thin, sharp-faced man named Aldo Ferrara who had stood near the Duke's shoulder through the whole trial, shifted his weight. Bianca caught it, the small movement, the way his eyes cut toward the villa's side gate like he was already calculating a way out. She filed it away, the same way her father taught her to notice which way a plant leaned before you ever asked why. Duke Matteo Visconti studied her for a long, silent moment. Something had cracked open behind his eyes, the same something Bianca thought she'd seen weeks ago, and told herself she imagined. "This trial isn't finished," he said finally, "nor is this accusation, but I will not condemn a woman on a vial that could belong to anyone." He never got the chance to say more. Thunder rolled low over the hills, and the sky that had been clear an hour before had gone the color of a fresh bruise. The wind picked up sharp and sudden, carrying the smell of rain and something colder underneath it, something that made the hair rise on the back of Bianca's neck. A rider came pounding through the gates before anyone could speak again, half falling off his horse in his hurry, shouting words that made Bianca's stomach drop clean through the ground. The upper dam, the one that fed water down through every field in the valley, including the 12 official plots and the golden wheat Bianca had bled for, it was cracking, and with a storm like this bearing down, it wouldn't hold till morning. Bianca didn't wait for permission this time, she was already running. She reached the dam an hour later, soaked to the bone, mud sucking at her boots with every step, and found Enzo and his sons already there, along with a dozen other farmers who'd heard the same warning and came running the same as she had. The water roared behind the old stone wall, black and furious in the storm light, and a jagged crack ran clean down its face like a wound that refused to close. "If it breaks," Enzo shouted over the wind, "it takes everything, your field, every plot below it, the whole valley floods." Bianca's chest tightened around the thought of her golden wheat, weeks of aching backs and bleeding hands, about to be swallowed whole. But there wasn't time to grieve something that hadn't happened yet. "Trenches," she shouted back. "We dig diversion trenches now, and we pray it's enough to slow the water till the wall holds or somebody shores it up." They dug in the dark and the driving rain, shovels biting into mud that fought back with every stroke, and Bianca's bandaged hands split open again under the strain, blood mixing with rainwater she didn't have time to notice. Somewhere behind her, she heard hoofbeats, and she turned just long enough to see Duke Matteo Visconti riding hard through the storm, no crown, no fine coat, just a man throwing himself off his horse and grabbing a shovel from Costanza's trembling hands. "Show me where," he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice held no distance in it at all. Bianca pointed him toward the cracking wall, and Matteo waded straight into the water without hesitation, bracing his shoulder against stone that was giving way beneath the pressure, holding it with nothing but his own weight while men piled sandbags and mud against the breach. Bianca watched him there, soaked through, hands raw, jaw set with an effort so pure it stole something loose in her chest, and she understood in that moment that this was a man finally meeting the land the way it deserved to be met. Not from a distance, not from silk and stone steps, on his knees in the mud fighting for something worth saving. They held the wall until dawn. By the time the storm broke and pale light crept over the hills, the dam still stood, battered and patched but standing, and the diversion trenches had carried the worst of the overflow safely around the fields instead of through them. Bianca's wheat still stood too, bruised and flattened in places but alive, alive after everything. It was in that grey morning light that the guards caught Aldo Ferrara. He tried to slip away during the chaos of the storm, a satchel of his own strapped across his back, heavy with forged land deeds and financial ledgers he never should have been carrying in the first place. He didn't get past the eastern road before Matteo's own men brought him down, and when they opened that satchel in front of the whole gathered court 2 days later, the truth spilled out for everyone to see. A syndicate of officials, Ferrara chief among them, had been dumping chemical runoff into the estate's soil for over a year, poisoning good land on purpose so they could buy it up cheap once the Visconti family gave up on it as worthless. The ledgers named names, they named prices. And tucked among the pages, they named a desperate young noblewoman who'd been promised her failing debts erased in exchange for her silence. And later, when silence wasn't enough to save her chances with the Duke, in exchange for sabotage. Lady Vittoria Contarini didn't deny it when they brought her before the court. She only wept, the kind of weeping that comes when a person finally sets down a weight they've been carrying so long they forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. "I was drowning," she said quiet, all the ice gone out of her voice. "I thought ruining her was the only way to keep from drowning myself." Bianca didn't hate her for it. She understood too well what desperation could make a person do. But understanding wasn't the same as excusing, and the court dealt with Vittoria and Ferrara, both the way corruption like that deserved to be dealt with. What mattered more to Bianca, standing in that courtroom with mud still dried under her fingernails, was what came after. Duke Matteo Visconti stood before the whole gathered court, the same court that had laughed her out of the gates a month before, and he didn't speak like a duke handing down a verdict. He spoke like a man who'd spent a long night in the mud, finally understanding what he should have seen from the very beginning. He dismantled the old estate system piece by piece, right there in front of everyone. Fair wages for every farmer who worked Visconti land, real rights to the ground beneath their feet, not just the promise of work until the next bad harvest cost them everything. And every reform he named, he credited to the woman standing at the back of the courtroom in her plain brown dress, the one nobody had thought worth inviting through the gates. Then he crossed the stone floor until he stood right in front of her, and for once he didn't sound like a duke at all. "I was wrong," he said, quiet enough that it felt like it belonged only to the two of them, even with the whole court watching. "Wrong to turn you away, wrong to trust silk over truth. You saved this land before I ever gave you the right to try, and I have no business asking anything more of you than your forgiveness." Bianca looked at his hands, still raw and blistered from the night at the dam, matching her own. "You held that wall until it stood," she said. "That's not nothing." "It's not enough either, not if it comes without asking you properly this time." He took a breath like a man about to hand over something fragile. "I'm not offering you a trial anymore, Bianca. I'm asking you to build this land back with me, as my equal, as my wife if you'll have me, but as my equal first, because I've learned by now which one of those actually matters." Bianca thought of her father, 3 winters gone, and the words he used to say when everything else had failed her. "The land doesn't lie." She looked out past Matteo's shoulder, past the crowded courtroom, toward the fields where her wheat still stood gold and stubborn after everything the storm had tried to take from it, and she found she didn't need to think very long at all. "Then let's get to work," she said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Bianca Morty smiled like she meant it all the way through.